Hey guys, it's Miss Rose, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Nearpod application activity. So, one of the big things that I really want you getting out of this unit is the idea that um, when faced with a piece of satirical nonfiction, you first must begin immediately with the idea of what is being criticized. You have to start by stating that somewhere. What ultimately is being criticized, mocked, um, looked at closely within the satire, because that's the reality of the piece. The humor is a rhetorical strategy being used to achieve that. So it's important to realize that there's a true argument, an overarching critical intent, even though what you're reading on the surface seems like a newspaper article. If we're looking at the Onion's piece about the girl who loves her Cliff's Notes reading experience. So I wanted to kind of walk you through how to use this chart. We've had a lot of questions, and again, I didn't create this chart. I got this at an AP training, and I'm trying it out for the first time. So forgive any of the confusion, please, but I hope that this clarifies some things. So several people had some questions about this column, the how patterns in the author's construction work or appeal to the audience, and then the how the unifying relationship between the patterns that you see. Is there some kind of repetition, contrast, juxtaposition, shift, or similarity? So I kind of wanted to walk you through this a little bit and show you a couple that I did, so that you maybe can look at your work and assess whether or not you're going in the right direction. So the first thing you really need to know is, well, what is this Onion article actually satirizing? What is the thing that's being criticized? And so I don't want to necessarily give you that answer, but I think the chart does in ways. So, the idea is this act of using these summaries like Sparks Notes and Cliffs Notes. That's the thing that's being criticized. A student's kind of lazy approach to the actual scholarship that exists in a college setting. And in the face-to-face setting, we talk a lot about things like Socratic circles and papers that you write about literature when you yourselves have done this same thing. I can't tell you how many times I've sat through Socratic circles and things like that, where I've heard kids just stating the Sparks Notes, and really trying to pretend that their knowledge of the book, their reading of the book, maybe is more erudite than it is, or that maybe they've read it at all. Okay, so and the other thing is, how does a student get into the situation where they're reading the Sparks Notes instead of the novel? And a couple of things may arise. One, they may not be confident with their reading of text, which I would still say using Cliff's Notes to decide whether or not you're right or wrong in a in the world of scholarship, I would say is a mistake, because um, it's not moving you to actually work your critical thinking muscles, and therefore they kind of atrophy over time if you don't kind of take those risks. So one thing is, a student might use Cliff Notes to avoid taking the risk of getting at meaning. Another thing can be the student has procrastinated, they've waited way too long, they have way more to do than they have time to do, so they substitute the act of reading the novel with the act of Cliff Notes. And then again, it could just be like a student doesn't want to read the novel, they're lazy about it, and they're just doing shortcuts so that they can get it done. Okay? But any one of those things would be the thing that's being criticized. And if we look at some of those words that came out of the Nearpod, especially under vices, follies, and the seven deadly sins, Definitely, you could say that this is sloth or laziness or sloppiness. Okay, um, and then you could also say that it's willful ignorance. Excuse, sorry. Um, excuse me. So, what you have to do when you're analyzing and looking at satire is realize that the humor is the strategy. The satirical nature of the piece is the strategy, but the criticism, the thing that should be changed, that's the argument. So instead of saying that the argument in this is that the Cliff Notes for Mice and Men is good, you would want to elevate into meaning and say that the meaning of the text is to criticize the act of using Cliff's Notes in a scholarly setting. So once you kind of feel like you've got it, then you sort of go through. So here, when we look here, really, if these instructions up here have you a bit confused, just kind of ignore them and think about it this way. You're going through those mental movements, those logical movements that we've learned to go through when writing rhetorical analysis. So first, we're going to describe it. Now, because the satire isn't real, the reality is that this act is being criticized, you have to kind of break it down. So in this column, it just looks at the surface. Okay. So we see that an interview style is being used. Definitely it's hyperbolic because she says it's the most emotional moment of her academic life. There's some realistic details to kind of, lampoon this setting. And let's see, the stereotype. I'm not sure what the stereotype there is. I'm not sure what that teacher meant there. But definitely, these are just the surface features. And then when we move to this section here, what we want to do is start to use some of the terminology that we're learning, some of that content vocabulary that we're learning to help further kind of name the rhetorical strategy. So, yes, this is mocking that type of talking, like there's nothing worse than a Socratic circle where people are sitting there exchanging sparks notes ideas because it's all so fake, it's such a play. And so it's mocking that. It's mocking the superficial, shallow nature, the unscholarly nature of it. There is an exaggerated kind of thing happening here because we have this image of someone sobbing in response to Cliff's notes. So that's absurd. Okay. So here, where I think this one was blank for you guys, but I filled it in. And so I look at this chart more as how this thing works in the piece as a whole. So similarity in images and words for me is what I'm seeing. Like the idea of this girl being emotionally reactive to the cliffs notes. That image keeps popping up. She keeps saying these just overly kind of silly, absurd, hyperbolic things about the cliffs notes themselves. So there's this similarity, this kind of pattern of that happening. Okay. And so then when you practice your analysis, this is kind of what you should be doing. Okay. So the image of an openly sobbing student exaggerates the reaction to the Cliff's Notes. The Cliff's Notes does not have the emotional meaning and intent that the actual book would. So the exaggeration criticizes how dependent she has become on the Cliff's Notes. She has missed out on the true beauty of reading the actual book, which underlines the author's criticism of a student who would bypass the educational and literary experience because of laziness. It is this lazy approach to learning that the onion piece mocks. Okay. Um, Here's one that I did uh, to show you. I kind of like don't want to show you everything. La 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 la. Okay. Okay. So, as we move further, what do we say in this next paragraph? This book has changed me in a way that only great literature summaries can. Who was, said Weaver, who was shaken by the experience that she requested an extension on her English 229 essay. Okay. So, if we kind of just describe the surface features, what do we have? English 229, that feels like a real course number. Um, Now, the asking for the extension is what pulls it into absurdity and mocking, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But students often ask for extensions, and that's sort of a normal student behavior, even though it isn't preferred, and oftentimes it's poo-pooed at the collegiate level. Very, very serious to meet deadlines. And oftentimes professors can be highly resistant to giving you extensions. So there's that element of asking for an extension. That those types of things actually do happen. But the absurdity, the thing that's happening that's kind of moving it into this satirical and verbal irony is because it juxtaposes the idea that she took the shortcut anyway. She's already taken the shortcut reading the Cliff's Notes instead of the novel. And so asking for an extension on her essay, why? What's the reasoning for that? It almost juxtaposes the laziness again with, I guess, another human vice, which would be, being late, not let's see, are there words? Um, Well, there's lack of self-control for sure. There's a short-sightedness in that thinking because, if you were to ask for an extension, but then write the paper using the Cliff's Notes, then, of course, you're kind of outing yourself as having done that. So here's kind of my analytical thinking about it. The Onion pokes fun of the absurdity of reading Cliff's Notes over reading a novel via the satirical and understated jab at the laziness of the student. A college student's procrastination and corner cutting is the object of criticism, and the request for an extension serves to underline the reason someone has gotten into this situation in the first place. Juxtaposing the intended request for an extension against the act of reading Cliff's Notes further underlines the foolishness of avoiding reading the novel in the first place. So I hope this kind of helps clarify how to use this chart. The purpose of these things, first we go from kind of just what do we see on the surface? How might you describe it? What does it look like? What might it be mimicking? Then how can we begin to use some of that content vocabulary to help us explain how it's working, why it would be a rhetorical strategy the author would choose to use? And then ultimately, how does it make meaning? How does the author use it to make meaning? And then finally, you want to kind of play around with your analysis. And again, these are rough, quick pieces that I've written here. So, when I move into writing my rhetorical analysis, my formative one over a satirical piece, this practice hopefully is going to get you prepared to do that a little bit more adeptly. So I do hope this has helped, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.